Karoline Leavitt stepped into the small-town courtroom with a mix of frustration and determination. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she wore a simple pair of jeans and a faded sweater. She didn't look like someone who belonged in a legal battle, more like someone who had just come from running errands or grabbing coffee at a nearby cafe. But here she was, clutching a crumpled piece of paper that detailed her parking ticket, ready to fight for what she believed was right. The room buzzed with the low hum of conversations as other people waited for their cases to be called. Some glanced nervously at the clock. Others flipped through notes they hoped would help them win their arguments. Karoline sat quietly in one of the wooden benches, trying to organize her thoughts. She had spent hours researching traffic laws online, jotting down key points on a notepad. Still, there was something about being inside the cold, formal walls of the courtroom that made her feel out of place. When her name was finally called, she stood up hesitantly, smoothing out her sweater before walking toward the front of the room. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression, peered down at her from his bench. His nameplate read, Judge Harold Whitaker, though most people simply referred to him as the strict judge. He wasn't known for his patience, especially when it came to defendants who showed up without lawyers or clear evidence to support their claims. Ms. Leavitt, Judge Whitaker began, his voice firm and clipped. You're here today contesting a parking violation. Do you have legal representation? Karoline shook her head. No, Your Honor. I'm representing myself. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Very well. Please state your case. Taking a deep breath, Karoline launched into her explanation. She spoke about how she had parked her car near the designated area, pointing out that the sign indicating restricted parking was partially obscured by overgrown bushes. She mentioned checking local ordinances and believed she hadn't violated any rules. However, as she continued, her confidence began to waver. Nerves got the better of her and she stumbled over her words. At one point, she accidentally misquoted a section of the municipal code, confusing two similar-sounding statutes. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his expression growing more skeptical with each passing moment. Are you certain about that, Ms. Leavitt? He asked, interrupting her mid-sentence. Because what you've just cited doesn't apply to this situation. Karoline's cheeks flushed red. I'm sorry, Your Honor. Let me clarify. But the judge held up a hand, cutting her off. Ms. Leavitt, if you're going to argue your case, you need to present accurate information. This isn't a guessing game. The comment stung, but Karoline pressed on. She tried to explain her reasoning again, only to find herself tripping over her own words. The harder she worked to make her point, the more flustered she became. It was as though her brain, which had been so clear during her late-night research sessions, suddenly froze under pressure. Meanwhile, the judge grew increasingly impatient. He tapped his pen against the desk, his frown deepening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed heavily. Ms. Leavitt, based on the evidence presented and the lack of clarity in your argument, I see no grounds to dismiss this ticket. You are fined $200. Next case. The gavel struck the wood with a sharp crack, signaling the end of her hearing. Karoline stood there for a moment, stunned. Her heart sank as she realized she'd lost. Not because she didn't know the law, but because she hadn't been able to communicate effectively. Slowly, she gathered her belongings and walked out of the courtroom, feeling defeated. Outside, the crisp autumn air did little to lift her spirits. She leaned against the courthouse steps, replaying the events in her mind. Why hadn't she been able to stay calm? Why had her carefully prepared notes failed her when it mattered most? As she mulled over these questions, she noticed a group of people chatting nearby. One of them, a middle-aged woman, caught sight of Karoline's dejected expression and approached her. Rough day in court? The woman asked sympathetically. Karoline nodded. Yeah, I thought I knew what I was doing, but I guess I didn't. The woman smiled kindly. Don't take it too hard. That judge isn't exactly known for giving second chances. But hey, maybe next time you'll knock him dead. Karoline forced a smile, thanked the woman, and headed home. What the stranger didn't know, and what even Karoline couldn't fully grasp at the time, was that beneath her quiet exterior lay a mind capable of unraveling the most intricate legal puzzles. She might not have won this round, but her story was far from over. Little did anyone realize that the young woman who walked out of that courtroom would soon prove to be anything but ordinary. Later that afternoon, Judge Harold Whitaker settled into his leather chair in the quiet solitude of his chambers. The day's cases were over, and he was finally free to unwind with a steaming cup of coffee. As he sipped the dark brew, he absent-mindedly flipped through the stack of files on his desk. Most were routine matters, speeding tickets, noise complaints, minor disputes, but one file caught his attention: Karoline Leavitt's. At first glance, it seemed like any other parking violation case. The details were straightforward enough: a disputed ticket, an obscured sign, and a defendant who hadn't managed to mount a convincing argument. But something about this particular file nagged at him. Maybe it was the way Karoline had stumbled over her words, yet still tried so hard to make her point. Or perhaps it was the faint sense of unease he felt after dismissing her case so quickly. Whatever it was, Judge Whitaker couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to take a closer look. Flipping open the file, he scanned the notes he'd jotted down during the hearing. His handwriting was neat but hurried, capturing fragments of Karoline's arguments and his own observations. Then tucked between the pages, he found something unexpected: a handwritten note from Karoline herself. It was brief, almost casual, but it referenced specific sections of municipal law that even seasoned attorneys rarely cited. The judge paused, his coffee forgotten. He stared at the note, rereading it several times to make sure he wasn't imagining things. How did someone without legal training know these obscure statutes? Intrigued, he pulled out his laptop and began searching online for anything related to Karoline Leavitt. At first, he came up empty-handed. No LinkedIn profile, no social media presence, nothing that suggested she was involved in legal circles. Just when he was about to give up, he stumbled upon a forum dedicated to discussing landmark court cases. Scrolling through the threads, Judge Whitaker noticed a username that appeared frequently: Legal Mind 101. The posts were insightful, often pointing out nuances in case law that others overlooked. One comment stood out in particular. It dissected a recent Supreme Court decision with remarkable clarity, breaking down complex legal jargon into simple terms. The user even predicted how lower courts might interpret the ruling in future cases. Impressed, the judge bookmarked the thread and continued exploring. As he dug deeper, he realized that many of the posts echoed the same level-headed reasoning and meticulous attention to detail he'd glimpsed in Karoline's note. Could it be possible? Was this anonymous contributor the same woman who had stood before him earlier that day? The idea seemed far-fetched, yet the evidence was compelling. Determined to find out, Judge Whitaker cross-referenced the timestamps of the forum posts with public records. Sure enough, they aligned perfectly with Karoline's known whereabouts. By now, the judge was fully engrossed. He leaned back in his chair, letting the implications sink in. Here was a young woman who had walked into his courtroom looking utterly unprepared, only to reveal in a roundabout way that she possessed an extraordinary understanding of the law. What fascinated him most was how effortlessly she navigated dense legal concepts, translating them into language anyone could understand. It was a rare skill, one that took years of practice to master. But why hadn't she showcased this talent during her hearing? Why had she fumbled so badly? Judge Whitaker replayed the scene in his mind, recalling the nervousness in her voice and the way she hesitated whenever he challenged her. Perhaps it wasn't incompetence after all. It was fear. Fear of being judged, of not measuring up, of failing despite knowing she was right. The thought unsettled him. Had he been too quick to dismiss her? Too eager to label her as just another unprepared defendant? His guilt deepened as he considered the broader context. From what little he knew about Karoline, she didn't come from privilege or opportunity. She worked as a waitress at a local diner, struggling to make ends meet while pursuing some kind of passion on the side. And now, thanks to his oversight, she was $200 poorer. a significant amount for someone living paycheck to paycheck. The irony wasn't lost on him. A woman with such potential had been penalized because she lacked the confidence to present her knowledge effectively. Determined to learn more, Judge Whittaker reached out to a colleague who specialized in pro bono work. Together, they combed through databases and spoke to mutual contacts, piecing together fragments of Karoline's life. They discovered that she had grown up in foster care, bouncing from home to home until she aged out of the system. Despite the instability, she had excelled academically, teaching herself subjects that interested her through library books and online resources. Law, it turned out, was her true calling. She devoured every book and article she could find, immersing herself in the intricacies of justice systems around the world. Yet, for all her brilliance, Karoline remained humble. She didn't seek recognition or accolades. Instead, she used her knowledge to help others. Neighbors often sought her advice on tenant rights or small claims disputes, and she always offered guidance without expecting anything in return. To those who knew her, she was simply Karoline, the friendly waitress who happened to know a lot about the law. Judge Whittaker sat back, overwhelmed by what he had uncovered. This wasn't just a talented individual, it was someone who embodied the very principles he had sworn to uphold: fairness, integrity, and a commitment to justice. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. By finding her earlier that day, he had inadvertently punished the qualities he valued most in a legal professional. That evening, as he drove home, Judge Whittaker couldn't stop thinking about Karoline. He imagined her sitting at her kitchen table late at night, poring over case studies and drafting insightful analyses under the glow of a dim lamp. He pictured her serving customers at the diner, quietly listening to their problems and offering solutions without ever revealing her depth of expertise. And he wondered how many others like her existed. Hidden gems whose talents went unnoticed because society failed to see beyond surface-level appearances. For the first time in years, Judge Whittaker felt a spark of excitement about his role in the legal system. He had spent decades presiding over mundane cases, enforcing rules, and maintaining order. But now he saw an opportunity to do something different, to mentor someone who could change the face of justice itself. As he parked his car and stepped out into the cool night air, he resolved to reach out to Karoline, not as a judge passing judgment, but as a man seeking redemption for both himself and the system he represented. The next morning, Judge Harold Whittaker arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. His mind was still buzzing with thoughts of Karoline Leavitt. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting in his courtroom, nervous, fumbling, and yet clearly brimming with untapped potential. The more he reflected on her story, the more he realized how much she reminded him of himself when he was younger. Back then, he had been a young lawyer eager to prove himself, often underestimated because of his modest background. But unlike Karoline, he'd had mentors who believed in him, guiding him through the complexities of the legal world. Now, it seemed like fate had placed someone in front of him who needed that same kind of support. Determined to learn more about her, Judge Whittaker decided to visit the diner where Karoline worked. It wasn't difficult to find. It was one of those cozy, family-run places tucked away in a quiet corner of town. As he pushed open the door, a bell above it jingled softly, announcing his arrival. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling pancakes filled the air, and the warm lighting gave the space a welcoming vibe. Scanning the room, he spotted Karoline almost immediately. She was balancing a tray loaded with plates, expertly weaving between tables while exchanging friendly banter with customers. For a moment, Judge Whittaker hesitated. What exactly would he say? "Hi, I fined you yesterday, but now I think you're amazing." That wouldn't go over well. Instead, he took a seat at an empty booth near the window and waited for her to notice him. When she finally approached, holding a notepad and pen, her expression shifted from cheerful to guarded as soon as she recognized him. "Your Honor," she said cautiously, her voice polite but tinged with surprise. "Is everything okay?" Judge Whittaker cleared his throat, suddenly feeling awkward. Yes, everything's fine. I just wanted to talk to you, may I?" Karoline blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Of course. Would you like some coffee? Or breakfast while we talk? He nodded gratefully. Coffee would be great, thank you. As she fetched his drink, Judge Whittaker tried to gather his thoughts. This wasn't a conversation he could rush. He needed to approach it carefully. A few minutes later, Karoline returned with a steaming mug and slid into the seat across from him. Her curiosity was evident, though she remained guarded, likely wondering why a judge would show up unannounced at her workplace. I've been doing some research, he began slowly, choosing his words carefully. About your case. And about you. Karoline stiffened slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Research? She echoed, her tone wary. Yes, he continued. I came across some notes you mentioned during our hearing, specific sections of municipal law, and I started looking into them. They're not easy to find unless you really know what you're doing. He paused, studying her face for a reaction. Then I stumbled upon something else. Online forums. Discussions about landmark cases. Posts written by someone who calls themselves Legal Mind Wawan. Karoline's eyes widened, and for a split second she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then, quickly composing herself, she offered a small, hesitant smile. That's me, she admitted quietly. I write about legal topics sometimes, just for fun. For fun? Judge Whittaker raised an eyebrow, unable to hide his skepticism. Ms. Leavitt, these aren't casual musings. Your analyses are detailed, insightful, and in many cases, more thorough than anything I've seen from seasoned attorneys. How long have you been doing this? She shrugged, looking down at her hands. A few years, I guess. Ever since I started teaching myself about the law, it's something I enjoy. And yet, he pressed gently, you didn't mention any of this during your hearing yesterday. Why is that? Karoline sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. Because I didn't think it mattered. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a degree or credentials. I figured no one would take me seriously anyway. Her honesty struck a chord with Judge Whittaker. He leaned forward, his voice softening. You're wrong, Ms. Leavitt. People should take you seriously. In fact, I should have taken you seriously. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and for that I apologize. Karoline looked up, startled. Apologize? For what? For underestimating you, he replied firmly. For dismissing your arguments without giving you a fair chance to explain yourself. You may not have presented your case perfectly, but that doesn't mean you weren't right. And it certainly doesn't diminish your understanding of the law. There was a long silence as Karoline processed his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, Your Honor. That means a lot. Encouraged by her response, Judge Whittaker decided to push further. Tell me something, Ms. Leavitt. Why do you care so much about the law? What drives you? Karoline hesitated, as if unsure whether to share such personal details with a virtual stranger. But after a moment, she began speaking, her words flowing steadily. Growing up in foster care, I saw a lot of injustice, she explained. Kids being overlooked, families torn apart, people slipping through the cracks because they didn't have anyone to fight for them. I always felt powerless back then, like there was nothing I could do to help. But when I discovered the law, it was like finding a lifeline. Suddenly I realized there were rules designed to protect people, to give them a voice. Even if I couldn't change the system overnight, I could at least understand it. Maybe someday, I thought, I could use that knowledge to make a difference. Her words resonated deeply with Judge Whittaker. Here was someone who had faced adversity head-on, using her struggles as motivation rather than letting them define her. She hadn't chosen the law out of ambition or prestige. She had embraced it as a tool for justice, a way to level the playing field for those who couldn't advocate for themselves. Impressive, he murmured, genuinely moved. Most people would have given up after facing the challenges you've endured, but you turned your pain into purpose. That takes courage. Karoline blushed, clearly unused to receiving praise. It's not much, she said modestly. Just trying to do what I can. Well, maybe it's time to do more. Judge Whitaker suggested, his tone turning thoughtful. Have you ever considered taking the bar exam? Becoming a licensed attorney? Her eyes widened in disbelief. Me? An attorney? I don't even have a college degree. That's not necessarily a barrier, he countered. There are alternative paths. Besides, based on what I've seen, you already have the skills. All you need is guidance, and maybe a little confidence. Karoline laughed nervously. Confidence isn't exactly my strong suit. It will be, Judge Whitaker assured her. With practice. Look, I'd like to help you if you're willing. Not as a judge, but as a mentor. Someone who can guide you through the process, introduce you to the right people, and help you navigate the challenges ahead. What do you say? For a moment, Karoline simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly a hint of a smile crept onto her face. Are you serious? Absolutely, he replied with a grin. Life has a funny way of giving us second chances. Let's make the most of yours. By the time Judge Whitaker left the diner, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. For years, he had wondered if his role in the legal system truly made a difference. Now he had his answer. Helping Karoline wasn't just about mentoring a talented individual. It was about empowering someone who could inspire change far beyond the confines of a courtroom. As he stepped outside, the crisp autumn air felt invigorating, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. A week had passed since Judge Whitaker's visit to the diner, and Karoline Leavitt still couldn't quite believe what had happened. The idea of becoming a lawyer, something she had once dismissed as an impossible dream, now felt tantalizingly within reach. But it wasn't just the possibility of passing the bar exam that excited her. It was the knowledge that someone believed in her. Someone like Judge Whitaker, whose stern reputation masked a deeply compassionate heart. True to his word, the judge wasted no time in setting things into motion. He arranged for Karoline to meet with a retired attorney named Margaret Hayes, a sharp-witted woman in her late 60s who had spent decades mentoring young legal minds. Margaret agreed to take Karoline under her wing, offering guidance on everything from studying strategies to courtroom etiquette. At first, Karoline felt intimidated by Margaret's no-nonsense demeanor, but she quickly warmed to her mentor's straightforward approach and genuine encouragement. Under Margaret's tutelage, Karoline began preparing for a mock trial, a challenge Judge Whitaker had devised to test her abilities. The premise was simple. She would argue a hypothetical case before a panel of retired judges and practicing attorneys. If she succeeded, it would prove not only her knowledge of the law, but also her capacity to think on her feet and articulate complex arguments clearly. Though hesitant at first, Karoline accepted the challenge, seeing it as an opportunity to prove herself, not just to others, but to herself as well. The weeks leading up to the mock trial were grueling. Karoline juggled her shifts at the diner, with hours of intense study, often staying up late into the night poring over case files and legal textbooks. Margaret pushed her hard, drilling her on statutes, precedents, and procedural rules until they became second nature. You don't just need to know the law, Margaret told her one evening. You need to live it, breathe it, make it part of who you are. Karoline took those words to heart, throwing herself into her preparation with unwavering determination. She practiced delivering opening statements in front of her bedroom mirror, recorded herself arguing motions to identify areas for improvement, and even recruited friends to play the roles of opposing counsel so she could sharpen her cross-examination skills. By the time the day of the mock trial arrived, she felt as ready as she could be, but nerves still gnawed at her stomach. The event was held in a small conference room at the local courthouse, transformed for the occasion into a makeshift courtroom. A long table served as the bench where 3 judges, including Judge Whitaker, and 2 senior attorneys sat waiting. Karoline stood at the podium, clutching her notes tightly as she surveyed the panel. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she reminded herself why she was here. To show them, and herself, that she belonged. The case centered around a fictional dispute between a tenant and a landlord over unsafe living conditions. Karoline represented the tenant, tasked with proving negligence on the part of the landlord. As she began her opening statement, her voice trembled slightly, betraying her anxiety. But as she delved deeper into her argument, something remarkable happened. The nervousness melted away, replaced by a quiet confidence that surprised even her. She spoke with clarity and conviction, weaving together facts, statutes, and precedents in a way that painted a compelling picture of injustice. When it came time for cross-examination, Karoline faced off against one of the senior attorneys playing the role of opposing counsel. The man was known for his razor-sharp wit and ability to rattle witnesses, but Karoline held her ground. She listened carefully to each answer, identifying inconsistencies and exploiting weaknesses in the testimony with surgical precision. The judges watched intently, their expressions unreadable as she dismantled the opposition's arguments piece by piece. By the time closing arguments rolled around, the room was electric with tension. Karoline's final remarks brought the case full circle, tying together every thread of her argument in a powerful conclusion. "Your Honors," she said, her voice steady and resolute, "this isn't just about one tenant or one apartment. It's about holding people accountable when they fail to uphold their responsibilities. It's about ensuring that everyone, regardless of income or status, has access to safe and dignified housing. That's what justice demands." As she stepped back from the podium, the room fell silent. For a moment, all Karoline could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. Then slowly, applause broke out. The judges and attorneys rose to their feet, clapping enthusiastically as they acknowledged the brilliance of her performance. Judge Whitaker beamed with pride, his eyes shining with admiration. Even Margaret, seated in the audience, allowed herself a rare smile. Afterward, the panel convened briefly to discuss their verdict. When they returned, Judge Whitaker addressed the room. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, his voice filled with warmth, "what you demonstrated today goes far beyond mere technical skill. You showed us passion, insight, and an unshakable commitment to justice. In my many years on the bench, I've seen few individuals, lawyers included, argue a case with such poise and intelligence. Consider this your official invitation to join the legal profession. You have our full support." The room erupted in applause once more, but Karoline barely heard it. Tears welled up in her eyes as she processed what had just happened. All those years of struggling, doubting herself and feeling invisible, it all seemed worth it now. For the first time in her life, she truly believed that she could make a difference. That evening, as she walked home under a starlit sky, Karoline reflected on how far she'd come. Just months ago, she had been an ordinary waitress, quietly writing about legal cases in her spare time. Now she was being recognized as a force to be reckoned with, a true legal genius. And yet, despite the accolades and praise, she knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much work to do, so many battles to fight. But for the first time, she felt ready to step into the arena, armed with knowledge, determination, and the unwavering belief that justice was worth fighting for. As she unlocked her apartment door and stepped inside, Karoline paused for a moment, letting the weight of the day sink in. Then, smiling to herself, she grabbed her notebook and pen. After all, there was always another case to analyze, another statute to explore. The journey ahead might be challenging, but she was no longer afraid. Not anymore. With the mock trial behind her, Karoline Leavitt's life began to transform in ways she could never have imagined. Judge Whitaker and Margaret Hayes didn't just offer words of encouragement. They rolled up their sleeves and became active participants in her journey. The retired judge used his connections to introduce Karoline to influential figures in the legal community, while Margaret helped her create a structured study plan for the bar exam. It wasn't easy juggling her responsibilities at the diner with her newfound academic pursuits, but Karoline approached every challenge with relentless determination. Margaret quickly realized that Karoline's greatest strength lay not only in her vast knowledge of the law but also in her ability to connect with people. "You don't just argue cases," Margaret told her one afternoon as they reviewed case studies over coffee. "You tell stories. You make the law human. That's rare and incredibly valuable." Karoline nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the advice. She had always believed that the law was about more than statutes and precedents. It was about protecting individuals, giving them a voice when no one else would listen. Margaret's words reinforced this belief, reminding her why she had fallen in love with the subject in the first place. As weeks turned into months, Karoline's confidence grew. She started attending local legal workshops and seminars, often staying late to ask questions or engage in debates with practicing attorneys. At first, some attendees were skeptical of her presence. After all, she didn't have a degree or formal training, but it didn't take long for them to recognize her brilliance. During one particularly heated discussion about constitutional rights, Karoline calmly dismantled an opposing argument with such precision that the room fell silent. When the moderator finally broke the silence, he said, "Ms. Leavitt, you should be teaching this class, not attending it." Word of her talent spread quickly, and soon invitations began pouring in. Law firms asked her to speak at events, community organizations sought her advice on pro bono cases, and even local news outlets expressed interest in profiling her story. Yet despite the growing attention, Karoline remained grounded. She knew she hadn't reached her goal yet. The bar exam loomed ahead like a mountain waiting to be climbed. Judge Whitaker continued to play a pivotal role in her journey, offering guidance and moral support whenever she needed it. He often invited her to his chambers after hours, where they would discuss landmark cases and hypothetical scenarios. These sessions weren't just educational, they were bonding experiences that deepened their friendship. One evening, as they sat across from each other sipping tea, Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You know," he said, "I've mentored plenty of young lawyers over the years, but none have inspired me the way you do. You remind me why I became a judge in the first place, to see justice served no matter how unlikely the circumstances." Karoline blushed at the compliment, unsure how to respond. "Thank you, Your Honor. I couldn't have done any of this without your help, or Margaret's." "Don't sell yourself short," he replied firmly. "Yes, we've guided you, but the hard work is all yours. And let me tell you something. When you pass the bar, and you will, you're going to change lives, not just through your arguments in court, but through the example you set. People like you are what this profession needs more of." The encouragement meant the world to Karoline, fueling her resolve to keep pushing forward. But the road ahead wasn't without its obstacles. Studying for the bar exam required long hours of intense focus, and the pressure sometimes felt overwhelming. There were nights when she doubted herself, wondering if she was truly cut out for this path. On those occasions, Margaret reminded her of the bigger picture. "Remember why you're doing this," Margaret said during one particularly tough study session. "It's not about proving yourself to anyone. It's about giving others the tools they need to fight for their rights. Every hour you spend studying brings you closer to making that happen." Those words stuck with Karoline, helping her push through moments of doubt. Slowly but surely, she began to master the material, tackling complex topics with increasing ease. Her natural curiosity and analytical mind made her an ideal candidate for the rigorous demands of the bar exam, and by the time registration opened, she felt as prepared as she could be. On the day of the exam, Karoline arrived early, clutching her ID and admission ticket tightly. The testing center buzzed with nervous energy as hundreds of candidates filed into the room, each carrying the weight of years of education and preparation. Karoline took a deep breath, reminding herself that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. As the timer started and the questions appeared on her screen, she focused all her attention on the task at hand. For 2 grueling days, she poured everything she had into the exam, answering multiple-choice questions, drafting essays, and navigating performance tests designed to simulate real-world legal challenges. By the end of the second day, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, but she refused to let it show. Walking out of the testing center, she allowed herself a small smile. Whether she passed or failed, she had given it her best shot, and that was something to be proud of. Weeks later, as she waited for the results, Karoline threw herself into volunteer work, using her growing expertise to assist underprivileged communities. She partnered with a nonprofit organization that provided free legal aid to tenants facing eviction, drafting letters, filing motions, and offering guidance to overwhelmed clients. Seeing the gratitude in their eyes reminded her why she had embarked on this journey in the first place. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. An email notification popped up on her phone. The bar exam results were in. With trembling fingers, Karoline opened the message and scanned the text. For a moment, she simply stared at the screen, unable to process what she was reading. Then slowly, a grin spread across her face. She had passed, with flying colors. Overwhelmed with emotion, Karoline called Judge Whitaker immediately. He answered, on the first ring, his voice brimming with excitement. "I assume congratulations are in order?" he said before she could even speak. "I did it!" Karoline exclaimed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I actually did it!" "Well, of course, you did," he replied warmly. "I never doubted you for a second. Now get ready, because this is just the beginning." True to his word, opportunities began flooding in. Prestigious law firms extended offers, eager to add her to their teams. Community organizations invited her to serve on advisory boards. Even the local university reached out, asking if she'd consider teaching an introductory course on civil rights law. Karoline carefully weighed her options, ultimately choosing to join a firm known for its commitment to public service. It was a perfect fit, a chance to use her skills to advocate for those who needed it most. As she settled into her new role, Karoline reflected on how far she'd come. From a shy waitress struggling to contest a parking ticket to a licensed attorney fighting for justice, her journey had been anything but ordinary. Yet she knew she couldn't have done it alone. Judge Whitaker, Margaret, and countless others had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. Their faith had carried her through the darkest moments, propelling her toward a future brighter than she ever dreamed possible. One evening, as she stood on the balcony of her modest apartment overlooking the city lights, Karoline felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready to face them head-on. Justice might be complicated, messy, and imperfect, but it was worth fighting for. And she was exactly where she was meant to be. Years passed, and Karoline Leavitt's name became synonymous with resilience, brilliance, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Her journey from a diner waitress to a celebrated attorney inspired countless others who felt trapped by their circumstances. She quickly earned a reputation as someone who didn't just win cases but transformed lives. Whether she was representing tenants in eviction disputes, advocating for children caught in foster care systems, or challenging discriminatory policies, Karoline approached each case with the same passion and dedication that had driven her since childhood. Her success wasn't measured solely by courtroom victories. It was reflected in the smiles of grateful clients, the tears of relief from families reunited, and the ripple effect of her work on communities that had long been ignored. Word of her achievement spread far beyond her hometown, attracting attention from national media outlets and prestigious legal organizations. Invitations to speak at conferences poured in, and soon she found herself standing before audiences filled with aspiring lawyers, seasoned attorneys, and even judges, all eager to hear her story. One such event took place several years after she passed the bar exam. It was a national conference hosted by a prominent legal advocacy group, bringing together some of the brightest minds in the field. The theme of the conference was Access to Justice: Breaking Barriers, and Karoline had been asked to deliver the keynote speech. As she stood backstage, adjusting her blazer and reviewing her notes, she couldn't help but reflect on how surreal this moment felt. Just a decade ago, she had walked into a small-town courtroom feeling invisible, dismissed, as unprepared and insignificant. Now she was preparing to address thousands of people who looked up to her as a trailblazer. When her name was announced, the auditorium erupted in applause. Karoline stepped onto the stage, the bright lights illuminating her path as she made her way to the podium. For a brief moment she paused, taking in the sea of faces before her. Then, with a deep breath, she began to speak. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady and warm. "When I was asked to give this speech, I spent days wondering what I could possibly say that would resonate with all of you. After all, many of you are already doing incredible work, fighting for equality, championing the underserved, and redefining what justice means in our society. What could I, a woman who started her journey serving coffee at a diner, add to that? The audience chuckled softly, leaning forward in anticipation. Karoline smiled, her confidence growing as she continued. I realized that my story isn't unique because of me. It's unique because of the obstacles I faced along the way. Growing up in foster care taught me two things. First, that life can be brutally unfair, and second, that fairness is worth fighting for. When I discovered the law, I saw it as a tool, a way to level the playing field for those who didn't have a voice. But let me be clear. My journey wasn't easy. There were times when I doubted myself, times when the system seemed designed to keep people like me out. And yet, here I am today. Not because I'm extraordinary, but because I refused to give up. She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was utterly silent, every ear tuned to her every word. What kept me going wasn't just my love for the law. It was the people who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. A judge who saw potential where others saw failure. A mentor who pushed me harder than I thought possible. Friends, colleagues, and strangers who reminded me that change begins with one person willing to take a stand. That's why I'm here today. Not just to share my story, but to remind each of you of your power to make a difference. Karoline went on to talk about the importance of accessibility in the legal profession, urging institutions to create pathways for individuals from diverse backgrounds. She shared anecdotes from her own experiences, highlighting moments when kindness, encouragement, and opportunity had changed the course of her life. By the time she concluded her speech, the audience was on its feet, giving her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Tears glistened in her eyes as she looked out at the crowd, overwhelmed by the realization that her journey had touched so many lives. Backstage after the speech, Judge Harold Whitaker waited for her, his face beaming with pride. He had traveled across the country to attend the conference, eager to see her shine. As they embraced, he whispered, "You've come a long way, Ms. Leavitt. I couldn't be prouder." "Thank you," Karoline replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I wouldn't be here without you." Over the following years, Karoline continued to break barriers, using her platform to advocate for systemic reforms and inspire the next generation of legal professionals. She founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free legal education and resources to underprivileged youth, ensuring that no one would feel excluded from pursuing their dreams. Her efforts earned her numerous awards, including recognition from the American Bar Association and invitations to serve on influential policy-making boards. Despite her growing fame, Karoline remained humble, always remembering where she came from. She still visited the diner occasionally, sitting in her favorite booth and chatting with old friends. To them, she wasn't a high-powered attorney or a keynote speaker. She was simply Karoline, the girl who had once served them pancakes and poured their coffee. Judge Whitaker, now retired, often joined her for lunch during these visits. Their conversations ranged from nostalgic reflections on her early days in the courtroom to discussions about the future of the legal system. Though their roles had shifted over the years, from judge and defendant to mentor and mentee, their bond remained unshakable. One afternoon, as they sat together sipping coffee, Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair and studied her thoughtfully. "Do you ever think about how different your life might have been if I hadn't found you that day?" he asked with a twinkle in his eye. Karoline laughed, shaking her head. "Honestly, I try not to dwell on what-ifs. All I know is that everything happened the way it was supposed to. That ticket led me to you, and you led me to this life, so thank you for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself." The judge smiled, raising his mug in a mock toast. "2 second chances," he said. "2 second chances," Karoline echoed, clinking her cup against his. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the town, Karoline reflected on how far she had come. Her story was proof that greatness often emerges from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes All it takes is one person willing to believe in you to change the course of your life. For Karoline, that person had been Judge Whittaker, and now she was paying it forward, inspiring countless others to dream bigger, fight harder, and never stop believing in the power of justice. Her journey was far from over, but then again, neither was the fight for a fairer, more inclusive world.